Well, welcome back to another episode of Parker's Pensées. This is a podcast where we explore thoughts in philosophy, theology, nature, and life. I love thinking about cool stuff, so come think with me. Today's podcast is really exciting for me. We're going to be talking about fashion theology, and if some of you think those two might not go together, you're not alone. I thought the same thing when I first heard about this book, but it's awesome. So we're going to get into it. This book is actually called Fashion Theology. It's what we're going to be covering. It's by Dr. Robert Covolo. And so I'm really excited to jump in. Before we do that, just want to give a shout out to the Patreon supporters and the Anchor supporters. You guys are the best. You guys are making this podcast happen. If you want to support this podcast, a great way to do that would be go to Apple Podcasts and leave me a 5-star review and give me a comment. That would be awesome. That would actually really help a ton. Please go and do that. But now, without further ado, Robert, thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Hey, great to be on the podcast. Welcome. Thank you.
Yeah, man, this is fantastic. So, just jumping in, how did you even get into the idea of fashion theology?
Okay. Well, I think that there's been several things that kind of led to this. One is there is an emerging theoretical discourse that has just exploded across the globe, which I had no idea about when I was going through university. But fashion studies has gone all over the globe. And it's now, when you actually start finding out how many different universities have fashion studies programs, it's quite shocking. And so when I was a university pastor, I just came across students that were studying this, and I'd never even heard of it. Yeah. And so I just was curious what they were studying. Some of them were attending my church. I was trying to pastor them, shepherd them, and they could not figure out how their Christianity related to this entire body of theoretical discussion. And so as someone that is convinced that Jesus is Lord of everything, I was trying to figure out, what does it mean for Jesus to somehow be involved or interact with this field of theoretical discourse. And so there was that kind of thing. There was just people I knew in my church that were in the fashion world. And then strangely, I wanted to go back and do PhD studies, and I picked up some Abraham Kuiper, and I actually read a speech he gave to a bunch of educated, reformed folk in the 19th century in Amsterdam. And it was on the relationship between, among other things, fashion and secularization. And I was like, what? I've never heard of this. And so he just said all kinds of interesting and somewhat prophetic things in this speech about the relationship between fashion and secularization. So I had to do a writing sample to get into a PhD program. And I thought, well, I'll write on this. And that just began opening the door more and more for me to further explore the issue of the relationship between fashion and the Christian faith.
That's so awesome. So it came partly through this pastoral wanting to help your students see this part of their life, which they're studying, in light of Christ, which is awesome. I think that's how things should go. So you said you read some Kuiper. We talked a little bit off air about some Dutch theology stuff. Do you consider yourself within that Kuiperian sphere? Would you consider yourself a Kuiperian, or maybe not?
Yeah, I'm Kuiperian. It's always weird to line yourself up with any given tradition, because hopefully your thought is not just simply beholding to a tradition, right? And any tradition needs to be updated.
That's right.
And no tradition got it all right. But I would say that I have been deeply imprinted by the Kuiperian tradition. And I think it's also deeply misunderstood, sadly, by many people that go through seminary. They see it as triumphalistic, or they see it as Constantinian or something like this. And here's a guy that, Kuiper himself broke away from the state church and paid heavily for it. And now he's seen as Constantinian. There's something really hilarious about that, and sad and tragic. But I've drawn a lot from him. And then of course, it's actually a larger tradition itself. And the Dutch tradition it's massive. There's a whole theological universe within the Dutch Reformed tradition that is so much bigger than Kuiper.
That's awesome. Well, and this does fit in with the Kuiperian project of seeing everything in light of Christ. Christ owns everything. There's not one square inch that he doesn't cry, that Christ doesn't cry mine, and I rule it. And that's so interesting because even fashion, belongs to Christ, and so we have to look in light of that. I was really intrigued as I was reading this I was intrigued by Tertullian's view that whatever is plastered on is of the devil, and then what you said about Augustine, that amongst all the other things that he initiated, that he inaugurated, that he started, he's also can be seen as the father of fashion theory. Can you explain Augustine's view on fashion? How does that work?
Yeah. So Augustine was living with some of the nascent, emerging late empire forms of fashion. Fashion is not something that exists at all times in all places. It's a certain kind of logic within dress that takes place when there's certain elements. And the late Roman Empire was a place where there was fledgling fashion. It's not like the modern kind of fashion system. But Augustine was deeply aware of this. And in fact, as the book shows, early church fathers were deeply aware of dress, right? Like in ways that would put all of us to shame how serious they took dress. Seriously. And how much they believed it was a very important facet of human existence that needed to be taken very serious. But Augustine finds himself in a unique position as someone who's done extensive thinking on hermeneutics and on how meaning arises within texts. And Augustine is aware that dress is a form of a text. And so he begins kind of working some of that out. He also has his two kingdoms theology. And that is, in some ways, I think, holding him back in ways. So he's an interesting character. He's definitely pushing against Tertullian's strong division between the church and broader culture. And yet at the same time, I think that he also still has some things in there that keeps a full kind of like flowering of fashion in check. Yeah.
But that's great. That's a great summary of what you wrote in here. And for those listening, it's really hard to summarize. It's such a massive work. So buy the book for sure. We're not going to cover everything, but I do appreciate Robert coming on and helping us with this. Can you talk about the logic again, the logic of fashion, how it doesn't emerge? Because in my head, there's certain things that people do where they absolutize stuff. So everyone's a philosopher, everyone's a theologian, because everyone has philosophical thoughts or a worldview or thoughts about God. And so it might be easy to say, well, everyone is engaged in fashion because you think about what you put on. But that's not what you said. You said fashion arises when certain elements. Can you help us think through that sentiment? How is it that that there cannot be fashion at a certain time and place?
Right. We commonly talk about fashion as synonymous with dress, but the fact of the matter is fashion is not the same thing as dress. Fashion does involve adornment, and so it involves dress. When we're speaking about fashion proper, we can talk about anything being fashion. But when we just talk, for instance, if we talk about just fashion in general, like we talk about maybe an idea coming into fashion, or we talk about maybe a certain car that's in fashion or something like that. What we mean is that object is part of a systematic process of replacement, and currently it is something that is grabbing our attention and is popular, but we know that it'll soon fade. And that kind of logic of rapid interplay and replacement is something that is part of the fashion system.
Okay. Now, there's probably all sorts of ways to define this and debate it, but are there sub-fashions, subcultures? So I'm thinking, today, what's fashionable popularly is going to be different than the like Gothic subculture who wants to wear all black and paint fingernails black. But in that culture, in that subculture, that subgroup, what's fashionable is wearing those black things that are kind of countercultural. How do we think through sub-fashions and stuff like that?
Yeah, there's subcultures, and subcultures will have their own logics that fit within their repertoire and within their internal kind of dialogue of meaning. But we must not confuse them because they're not always fashion subcultures. Okay. Like the Amish are not a fashion subculture. There's not a rapid interplay. We're not wondering what the Amish are going to wear 5 years from now or 10 years
Right.
from now, we know what the Amish will wear. They're an anti-fashion
Yeah.
form of dress. And so they
Okay.
transgress society, and they transgress the market and consumerism and on the different facets of fashion by virtue of their dress. But punks also transgress.
Hmm.
They might choose to just wear the same thing for years on end. I went through a transgressive stage where I wore a black tight-fitting T-shirt in my 30s and jeans for like a couple years. I just had like 20 of these shirts, and, I'm not doing it. Like I'm
Yeah.
not doing it. And so that's anti-fashion. And anti-fashion is something where you react against kind of that rapid interplay, and you refuse it. But tribes have anti-fashion. Tribes are not fashion societies. So the medicine man isn't like going to change up his outfit every day. He's just got his, he's got whatever that, maybe some animal he killed. He puts on that same thing every day, and it's a uniform.
Mm-hmm.
And so these are uniforms, and it's different than fashion. So that maybe helps kind of tease out a little more about how fashion operates.
That's very helpful. Yeah, that can you say the language again? The rapid trend, the rapid what? What was
the
it?
rapid interplay of clothing.
Yeah. Is there, in fashion theory, is there a set time, or does it kind of depend on the culture? Is it every 5 years or 10 years, or is it kind of a vague understanding?
So, fashion theorists don't agree on everything.
Sure.
In terms of the way in which, the rapid nature of that dress, I think that it can vary, and it varies at different times, different places. And so at what point you end up kind of like being in a fashion system, I'm not sure if there's a hard and fast like way of like defining that. But I do know there are clear examples of where you have a fashion system and then where you have a uniform, and then there's a lot of transit in between those. But generally speaking, fashion theorists want to say that fashion emerged. The dominant theory is in the West, in the north of Italy, the modern fashion system in the north of Italy around the time of Aquinas, which is why Aquinas talked about fashion in the Summa.
Yeah. Wow, that's so interesting. So even before that, there was this debate, and I can't remember who was talking about it, if it was Tertullian or Augustine or someone before them, about the pallium. I think I'm pronouncing that right. The pallium versus the toga, and that Christians ought to wear the more modest pallium. And I even look at the picture, and to me, it doesn't look that different. But to them, I'm sure it's a world of difference. But a pallium was like a more modest. It covered your arm, I think, as well. But that was like, was that a fashion debate proper, or was that like a proto fashion debate?
Yeah, I think Tertullian is aware that that the broader culture can begin prescribing what we're going to be wearing, and that really made Tertullian nervous. Tertullian's Theology of Culture, which really the book I wrote is kind of like basically a theology of culture, or cultural theology, if you will. And Tertullian wants to draw a really hard and fast distinction and keep everything within the church. And so in many ways, we talk about, it's been popular to say among certain groups that the church is a polis. The church needs to generate all its own culture.
Right.
And that just is ridiculous. I don't know about your church, but we'd have to go back to the Stone Ages if we were just, and I've got a smart church. We have some astrophysicists and bright people, but nobody can do everything. Like, we have to be a part of a broader culture.
Yeah.
And we borrow from larger non-Christian or a-Christian, cultural products and ideas. And there's no hermetically sealed way to do this. But Tertullian wants to keep that, because in many ways he wants to have a federal system. He also wants to see a uniformity of culture. Augustine challenges that, and the City of God is all about the idea that God can be working and Christianity can transcend the Roman Empire.
Yeah.
And so Augustine is relativizing dress in order to retain his argument. The pallium, when we look at the pallium and the toga, which is what Tertullian was writing about in one of his monographs, that no decent Christian man should ever wear a toga. And you look at the difference between a pallium and a toga, and you think, I don't even see a difference, And the difference really, I don't think the difference was that profound in his own culture. I think that what really mattered was that the job of church fathers at that time, in the mind of Tertullian, was to adjudicate between cultural differences and set up a uniformity, because only if you had uniformity can you have unity.
Mm.
And Augustine does not like that idea that uniformity and unity are the same thing. And and that actually goes all the way through Augustine's theology, not just in terms of his view of dress,
Mm-hmm.
right? So,
Yeah, that's great. And I think that going back to the Dutch thought, that I think they want to pull from Augustine in that and talk about the unity in diversity, and saying, we don't sacrifice the diversity for the sake of uniformity. We can have unity and still have diversity, and that's what Kuiper talks about in the organic motif, and Bavinck even further, which is just fantastic. And that's again why I love this book, because I think it fits so nicely within that frame. But you mentioned how modern fashion or fashion started around Aquinas's time, and I thought that was interesting. Thinking through Aquinas and temperance and what he was up to with his treatment of fashion, would you place him as is he similar to Augustine in wanting to find this golden mean of not too much and not too little, or was he more on the Tertullian side, or was he more lenient in his thought? Where do you put Aquinas?
yeah, Aquinas knew what he was trying to do. He was trying to reconcile Christian theology with Aristotelian
Mhm.
ethics, the Nicomachean ethics,
Yeah.
which is all about the golden mean. And he recognized within Augustine resources for his own project. Augustine is writing, of course, the City of God at a very different time in which Aquinas is, writing the
Yeah.
Summa. And when Aquinas is writing the Summa, he's attempting to give kind of a comprehensive understanding of how dress works within pre-modern forms of distributive justice,
Hmm.
and the role of hospitality and the role of virtue in the way we dress. Where I think Augustine is much more interested in trying to get away from the kind of narrowness of Tertullian,
Hmm.
because he had his own kind of Tertullianites that he was dealing with
Yeah.
during his own day, right? Because
Yeah.
he's a couple hundred years after
Right.
Tertullian, but he's so Aquinas is definitely all about temperance and moderation and a mean. That's huge for his understanding of what you do when you dress.
Yeah. And I really liked it too. So your book reminded me about the City of God, and it's just like, man, I want to pick that back up and read it, because it was really encouraging that. And same thing with Aquinas, like, man, I want to read this for myself as well, but particularly that view of temperance. And I think I don't want to be a curmudgeon and harp on the lost of the past, but I don't hear a ton about temperance today, and I think it's really challenging to bring up temperance when it comes to clothing.
Mm-hmm.
um, and just thinking like, yeah, I'm going to be temperate. I'm going to be uh, not overly modest and not a curmudgeon, but I'm also going to consider what I wear and how that affects people, and how this affects my virtue, how this affects who I am, and give thought to even my clothes. I
Mm-hmm.
was really challenged by that. It was really really fun to think through.
Mm-hmm.
So would you say that once Aquinas started thinking about fashion, that brought into Christian theology this idea that we should consider what we wear, or that what we wear can affect our virtue, or
Mm-hmm.
and can help us? What did Aquinas add to the conversation, I guess?
Yeah, Aquinas is not adding virtue as the issue with dress. That was an assumption that Christian theologians have held um, all the way through.
Okay.
Okay, so but he's challenging the way in which we understand the virtuous dress.
Okay.
And virtuous dress is not that we are uniform in
Mm.
dressing just like every other believer. Remember, Tertullian is writing from North Africa, and the culture that Tertullian is writing in actually ends up getting picked up, and then it becomes in many ways just digested and embraced within Islam, okay, where women are covered head to toe, okay. So
Yeah.
Tertullian's writing in that culture, okay,
Yeah.
as a Christian. This is
Wow.
before North Africa is conquered by
Right.
Muslims. And Augustine is a Latinist, and so he's writing not a North African. There's a huge difference between North African Christian culture and Latin Christian culture
Hmm.
in the 4th century. And
Yeah.
so Augustine's writing from a very different kind of cultural perspective, but he's also interested in virtue. But he wants to talk about other virtues beyond just simply modesty. He wants to talk about the virtue of harmony within society.
Yeah.
And so Augustine wants to talk about the way in which we can actually impact things such that we help society work better, in light of the way we're dressing. We're all things being equal, we're helping out just kind of the social order. And
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
Augustine's thinking in those terms, in hermeneutics and
Yeah.
and complex societies and how dress works in complex societies.
Yeah.
But Aquinas has a different agenda. Aquinas wants to talk about virtue in terms of giving honor to those to whom honor is due, which is actually a phrase in Scripture.
Mm-hmm.
And Aquinas wants to say, when you get dressed, by and large, it's not about you. It's not all just about you and your own expression, which this really pushes back against where we're at today.
Right.
Aquinas wants to say, when you get dressed, you're getting dressed with the idea that someone's going to look at you. Mm-hmm. So own that and think to yourself, how can I be hospitable to the people that are going to see me today, to who I appear to? How can I show dignity and respect? And we know this intrinsically. You don't show up on your wedding day in flip-flops and, in a swimsuit. Your bride to be would smack you.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, that's really helpful. And for me, what's interesting is it's not just about lust. It's not just about, hey, don't cause others to stumble. It's about there's even more to it in giving honor. And I wonder what else could be at play here. Is it, giving honor to those who deserve it? Would he consider, if you're going to someone of lower economic means, not flaunting your wealth through your clothes? Is that another aspect of this virtuous dress?
Yeah, I think that would be. I think that he would want to say that there's a way in which we can carry ourselves with dignity and a way in which we can treat others with dignity. Mm-hmm. I constantly hear from people just kind of on one hand, you want to reduce dress to the issue of modesty. Right. And that's something that I wrote the book in order to push against, because there's so much more that needs to be said. And anyone that does fashion studies immediately understands that modesty is only one conversation within a world of discussion. Yes. Yeah. But on the other hand, I want to say is, that doesn't mean as Christians we throw out the issue of modesty. You do communicate things such as sexual availability by the way you dress. You do draw the eye to certain kind of focal points when you're getting dressed. And so we do have a responsibility in that area. And I think, but Aquinas wants to say that there's just so much more in terms of, but we need to remember also Aquinas is writing during a time of pre-modern understandings of distributive justice, which wouldn't really match with our modern sense. Yeah.
That's helpful. This question might be better asked later, but I'm going to ask it, and we can pause and go back if we need to. But for Aristotle, and then for Aquinas, who picks him up, there's a strong sense of the natural law and the natural fittingness. And Aquinas, who wants to find this kind of natural law, and he's a realist about even definitions, that we can define things according to their natures. Does he see, is there an appropriate way to dress for your status in society? Like, you ought not dress above, like a janitor ought to wear his janitor uniform and not, a gold chain or not a three-piece suit when he's doing it. Is there anything like that with Aquinas that he's pulling from his natural law kind of stuff?
Yeah, there's two things that you actually brought up there. One is understanding the body as giving us cues or clues as to who we are. And, on one hand, you have kind of this natural law on steroids with Tertullian, where Tertullian will say, you should never dye your hair because God didn't give you, he gave you gray hair, so deal with it.
Right. I hear that still today. I still hear that same sentiment, right? Yeah.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Okay. Certain circles, depends.
Yeah, this is kind of like natural law on steroids. So, and then you have like Augustine pushing against that. If a wife wants to like help out, her husband, she can, dress up for him, use some makeup,
rouge,
Yeah, and Aquinas is like, yeah, so they're punching holes in this kind of idea of natural law. But on the other hand, Aquinas does have this idea of society as an organism.
Mhm.
Society is this kind of organism, and it's hierarchical. And so within that hierarchy, you display the appropriate dress and level of formality in light of where somebody fits within that hierarchy within society.
Yeah.
And we no longer have that view of society. And
Right.
so some of the things he says about dress, I think, would just throw us off. So,
Yeah. Yeah, that's so important to remember that they're men of their times, and their seats in Laban, and yeah, they're we don't just pluck from that and cherry pick and then throw that into your pulpit this coming week. I wanted to move on to Calvin because I thought Calvin was another interesting case because depending on how much you've read of Calvin or what you read of Calvin, he can be this austere, gaunt, really simple man who only wore black, and that's who he is. But he's also a Frenchman, and he also has some views on fashion. And so, can you help us think through what was Calvin's view, maybe in comparison to Aquinas? How much did he differ? Or what was Calvin's view on fashion?
mm-hmm. Yeah, Calvin wrote so much. He had
Mm-hmm.
so much to say about dress and fashion.
Mm.
It's shocking if you want to go into it, but then when you realize actually Calvin was doing what all civil magistrates, as all ecclesial magistrates were tasked by civil magistrates to do, which is to talk about early modern sumptuary legislation and to kind of support sumptuary legislation. Which was a way in which in a pre kind of, I mean, this is before this is before any kind of screens or,
Mm.
how did you communicate? By and large, by what you were wearing. How would you know someone's a police officer? It was what they were wearing. How would you know someone was, a dignitary? By what they were wearing. So
Yeah.
we can kind of look down our noses at sumptuary legislation, but really we're doing that with kind of an awful lot of technology at our disposal that helps us to have honest identification and not just live with urban strangers.
That's a great point. Yeah,
So
that's really, and today you could impersonate a cop by wearing a police uniform and carrying a gun and wearing a badge, and I think that's a crime. So yeah, we're not, even with all our technology, there's still laws on that stuff.
there's still laws on that stuff. Yeah.
Yeah.
So Calvin is actually incredibly he's incredibly conflicted in many ways when it comes to fashion. Calvin has this doctrine. He's a humanist. He's a humanist
Mhm.
scholar.
Yeah.
And Calvin, humanist scholars believe that humanity is endowed with gifts and
Yeah.
beauty and brilliance, and there's so much to celebrate, right? So
Yeah.
Calvin's reading the classics, and Calvin when Calvin would see human industry or any kind of like production by human beings that was noteworthy, he could appreciate it deeply. And so Calvin's not some sourpuss, I just, if I had another life, I'd spend it entirely disabusing people of these strange views they have of John Calvin.
Yeah.
People, by and large, who've never read John Calvin, or if they have, they've actually never placed him within his context.
Mhm.
But Calvin had a love for beauty, and he believed that beautiful clothing was a gift from God to be celebrated,
Mhm.
and that it was a help in life that we could dress up and that we could appreciate each other's appearances, and these were parts of a gift of a good creator. But then Calvin also at the same time, Calvin has a pretty radical social ethic. I mean, he would make a lot of woke folks seem kind of lame. He'd be like, yeah, glad you're on social media. We've all been down at the hospital and helping the orphans. And, Calvin
and they had the plague. Yeah.
all to shame. Yeah, during the plague. So, but then he would not separate personal and social righteousness in ways that would put us to shame as well. So Calvin would talk about, you really have to think about how you use your resources. And if you're spending all your money on yourself, enjoy the outfit because you're covering yourself in the blood of the poor people.
Yes.
Yeah,
I remember that line from the book. Yeah, that was huge.
Yeah. But Calvin talked about fashion designers. Calvin talks about he talks about so many things. He talks about this there was a popular thing where people would dress up like musicians and pretend like they're musicians as they walked around Geneva.
Mhm.
Kind of like people like to dress like rock stars today when they're not rock stars, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.
So there's a lot of relevance to Calvin's, like, and he talks about how, like, why are you doing that? Calvin's like, why are you doing that? Like, why are you breaking, are you bearing false witness as
Yeah.
you're doing this? You know, are you being
Yeah.
honest about who you are? And that is something that should throw us into tension, is
Mhm.
that one of the messages that comes out from Calvin very loudly, but in other Christians, one of the messages that comes out is that we are not to bear false witness,
Yeah.
which is fascinating. So
That is really fascinating. I wonder, just in my head, it pops up, thinking, how might I do this? Well, maybe I would lease a car that's way beyond me, and I would tell everyone that's my car. Maybe that's just overtly lying if I'm telling them, but if I'm not giving that appearance, does just a random thought, does fashion extend out to objects like your car, or is it limited to what you put on your body?
yeah, I think because fashion is oftentimes associated with conspicuous consumption or image management,
Yeah,
we oftentimes think of fashion in terms of those two vices. Or I don't know, image management's a vice per se, but it becomes a vice quickly,
sure.
especially if your whole life is spent just simply manufacturing images of
Yeah,
yourself,
right.
and there's no substance to who you are. And so it does, and as I said earlier, that the rapid interplay of consumer objects quickly falls within the logic of fashion. And I think, sadly, many of us live our lives extremely concerned about what other people think about us.
Yeah.
And social media has not helped this at all.
Mm.
And one of the things I wanted to do in the book is I didn't want to let fashion off the hook,
Yeah,
but I also didn't
yeah,
want to villainize it in ways that were not true.
yeah.
Um, yeah.
I think you did a great job of that because it motivated me to think about what I wear more, and my wife is very excited about that because she wants me to be more fashionable. And I kind of checked out a while back, uh, but it did motivate me that way, and I can imagine someone who is much more concerned about fashion being challenged in that as well from a different aspect, saying, "Do I think too much about, what is this kind of golden mean? What are we looking for? What's the right place for a Christian to think about fashion?" Uh, this brought me to the male suit, which I found really interesting because I never really thought I've had just random thoughts here and there about the suit, but I never thought, where did this come from? How did this become what men wear? And you traced it back, I think to the French Revolution. Is that right?
Well, it became popularized in the French Revolution, and actually can be traced back to bankers in London before the
That's right.
French Revolution. And yeah.
Okay, that was beforehand. And so, for the bankers, was this like an outfit, or was this a fashion statement for them?
Oh gosh, now you're really pushing my memory here
Sorry.
on the history of the suit.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think that there there might, I actually not sure. I mean, there
Okay.
definitely is a fashion logic operating when the bankers are doing this. So
Okay.
to what degree it was kind of the a fashionable thing, and how much it was a uniform for bankers.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, but I think the key thing is that the suit also was something that pieces of it were also attached to the American Revolution.
Hmm.
Eventually, the idea that every man would have a uniform was a push against hierarchical society, and it was consonant with the idea that there would be suffrage for all men.
Yeah.
Um,
That's
and
right.
yeah, so
Yeah. Which I found interesting. I remember that the suffrage for men because I'm not used to that language. I'm always used to women's suffrage, so it struck me that. But then it made sense when I thought through. But it's interesting because just like anything else, you can buy a $5,000 suit, or you can buy, a $30 suit off the rack or something, and you still have that hierarchical. You still have hierarchy based on suits still, and so I thought it was so interesting to think through how in one view, one logic, you can see yes, everyone's dressing the same, and then in a different logic, you're seeing there's still this hierarchy going on, and maybe it didn't play out that way back in when the British were doing it. Do you remember why the French picked it up? What was that about? Was that about smashing the hierarchy in society as well?
Oh my gosh, Parker. If you've ever read the history of the French Revolution, it is
Yeah.
shocking. I
Yeah.
think most Americans have no clue. We just think their revolution was like ours.
Yeah.
They actually, I mean, it was crazy. People would be killed for dressing like an aristocrat. If you walked through the streets of
Huh.
Paris and you were maybe wearing a vest that had like silk or certain things that were signatures of a higher class, you could head to the guillotine.
Okay.
Uh, and so, and in fact, during the high watermark of the terror in the French Revolution, um, they actually people started dressing like in togas, like classical dress, and everyone went out and worshipped the god of reason
Yeah,
out
the
in
Cult of
nature.
Reason. I know that
The
one.
cult
Yeah, I
of
didn't know about
reason.
the togas.
But
Wow.
even worse, check this out. So the group that was in control at that time actually put together a national uniform that everyone who
Hmm.
was French would wear. And so there was this kind of like uniformity. This is what Kuiper
Wow.
talks about when he talks about uniformity. There literally was a uniformity that came out of the French Revolution with
Yeah.
uniforms for everyone. Um,
Yeah.
and so, yeah,
Yeah.
and so, yeah, so there is this kind of like the French Revolution, but coming out of that, they eventually kind of the male suit became predominant as symbolic of this kind of equality for all, and it was embraced by Americans as well. It was embraced kind of as this rising consciousness of this idea that at least amongst men, that everyone should be able to vote,
Mhm.
everyone should have the same at least legal standing within society. Um, that ideal was expressed through the suit, and it's still expressed to this day through the suit.
Yeah. Yeah. So so the male suit was this was a marker for male suffrage, for equality of men, but w- we talked French Revolution. If you if you're dressing like a bourgeoisie or something, it's off to the guillotine. When it hit America, I wonder, were you allowed to wear like flair and set yourself out? Does it go against the male suffrage to wear a piece of flair to peacock yourself? Do you have any
Mm-hmm.
idea on that?
Yeah. Um, uh, well, let's just say that it take like Beau Brummel, okay, who was a
Mm,
fashion icon in England. I think
okay.
because of the Bloodless Revolution, you
Yeah.
might have more flair originating from there, you
Okay.
know. And so I think it's very local in terms of like what culture
Oh
and
yeah.
where you can have a little bit of flair. So
That's a good point. That's a
yeah,
really good point.
and it develops. You can see the development of you can go to like a fashion museum. You can go online actually, and they have the whole history of like the suit. You can see how
Ah,
it changed, through time, things like
yeah.
that. So,
That's really interesting. So it seems like to me, maybe in my generation, I'm a younger millennial. The people who wear suits are usually they're up here. Uh, just to me, like the people who wear suits are my professors wear suits. Uh, like professor, with elbow pads and stuff. But people, if I see someone wearing a suit, that's a banker. That dude is doing something with stocks. That dude is above me. He's not studying theology. And it seems like it's kind of switched from this we're all equal to now some are a little bit more equal than others. Uh, Not that I'm begrudging it. If I could get a really nice suit, I would. I might wear it around. If I ever become a professor, I'll definitely wear some arm pads and try to dress for my station there.
mm-hmm,
Uh, but
mm-hmm.
so moving on to well, I thought maybe we could touch a little bit more on Kuiper, and then your idea. You bring in theodrama, and I just jump on that because I study here with Dr. Van Hooser. So anytime I hear theodrama, I'm jumping on that. I don't know how much how important that is to your project, but can you discuss Kuiper's view of? We already talked a little bit, but a little bit more on Kuiper's view of fashion, and then get into some theodrama stuff.
Yeah. Kuiper is profound in that he's one of the first people, not Christians or theologians, to recognize how important fashion is for civil society and public space.
Hmm.
Um, and so he recognizes that there's a link between the mediating structures in society and the erasure of like the old form of kind of different classes and statuses and different guilds, all the different kinds of folk clothing that used to exist before the French Revolution.
Yeah.
He sees that connection there in terms of some of the shifts in society, and he's afraid for that shift. But profoundly, he ends up not only kind of like fearing the French and their fashions,
Yeah.
but he also, and this is quite interesting, is he also says that Christians don't have an option. We have to be engaged in fashion,
Mm.
simply because when you look at kind of the pros and cons, there's too much at stake in not being a part of the fashion system.
Yeah.
And so that's what makes fashion. That's what makes Kuiper really quite interesting. He can acknowledge the losses and he can acknowledge the dangers, and yet at the same time he doesn't say, just keep wearing your folk clothing that you had from old Europe. Be
Yeah.
engaged, but be engaged as a Christian.
Yeah. That really resonates with me because I really like being an evangelical in the theological sense. I know that language gets hijacked and kind of might be out, but I want to retrieve it if I can. It seems like the evangelical way of saying, look, we're not going to go full modernist here. We're not going to go all the way to the left here, but we're also not going to be so staunchly removed from culture that we can't impact it, that we can't reach people. We want to be in the world, but not of the world. And that's what Kuiper's idea seems like to me. It does seem like that kind of golden mean, but what's interesting is, like you just talked about, he does bring in kind of a moral imperative to be engaging in fashion. I wonder, what do you think about that? You personally, are you thinking, do Christians have a moral obligation to engage in fashion, you think? Or is it kind of like, if you're going to, you need to do so as a Christian?
I think something should be said here, which is not everybody needs to be doing the same thing with their life.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
I get that sometimes. Some people they become very concerned with maybe issues of justice or getting clean water, or some people have the gift of evangelism, and we just got to get everybody sharing the gospel with everybody. And so it's so easy for us to kind of take our particular gift or calling and then saying that's what everybody needs to do. There
Yeah.
are people that have a calling to the world of fashion. And I just got off a call with a young woman who's in Paris, and she's started a ministry there, and she's been engaged in the fashion industry for years and
Mm.
doing incredible things, and she's a creator, and she's someone that's just, that's her world. That's where God has called her.
Yeah.
And so, and not everybody has a knack for it. You can
Right.
just push back with your wife, Parker, and just say, honey, I just don't have an eye for this thing.
That's
I've got
right.
an eye for great arguments. I'm a philosopher. Or I'm a budding theologian, or, I'm a
Yeah.
pastor. I've got a heart for
Appreciate that.
preaching,
Yeah.
and help me, help me,
Mhm.
And so,
Yeah.
yeah, we don't
Yeah.
all have the same calling. But I do think that there is but dress, like every other cultural practice, carries within it certain faithful ways as a Christian, and they're not all
Yes.
the same ways, but there are faithful ways and unfaithful ways to be engaged in that practice. Not
Mm.
all practices are like that. There's things you should not be doing as a Christian, and
Right.
then there's several things that are part of our life, and those things need to come underneath our Christian convictions, and it will look different for different people in terms of how we end up investing or responding to that cultural practice.
Yeah. That's a great point. That was very, very helpful. Um, yeah, there's a couple things I'm tempted to touch, but I don't want to put my face in the buzzsaw. Um, but so thinking about moral imperatives and dress. So maybe not everyone has to engage in fashion in the same manner. That's cool. I'm down with that. When it comes to like temperance, I'm thinking like temperance and like yoga pants, and I probably always go this way because I'm a dude and very visual, and struggling with pornography when I was young, and we never think about guys like me never think about dudes with like after a workout walking around with a shirt off, it's always like, but girls are wearing yoga pants. It's like, yeah, but you're trying to show off your abs to these chicks, dude. Like, what are you doing? Um, why do you think that this has fallen out? So Tertullian, Augustine, Aquinas, all these dudes that we all look up to, we all admire, are talking about fashion and how we ought to dress. It doesn't seem like that's happening as much today. And if it is more of the shallow conversation of no good Christian would ever wear yoga pants from kind of the more fundies. Why do you think it is that we don't address fashion like our founding father or our fathers of the faith did?
Mm-hmm. Well, there's so many reasons. One of the reasons, though, I think that we don't recognize is that the same expressivism that is implicit within most people's approach to fashion has been instrumental in their own conversion to evangelical Christianity.
Mm.
And this idea that I have kind of I've followed, what seems right to me, and it's kind of a neo-romanticism that oftentimes is the tracks which Christianity runs on, but it has within it a strong expressivism. And so I think it's because of the proximity of fashion to our evangelical faith that we are unable to talk about it, not because of its distance.
Wow.
And so reducing it to issues of modesty is a helpful way for us to sideline really taking a close look at ourselves is what
Yes. Wow, man, that's a great point. Holy cow. Yes. Okay. That's so good. That's blowing my mind. What other, so what are we missing? Because we make it about modesty so much. You talked about Aquinas and you talked about Calvin and Kuiper, and there's more. That can be kind of a historical study, and this is what they did think. But now moving to kind of the normative, what besides modesty? Because I am so on that train of modesty. What else are we missing when we're not preaching on this? When we're boiling everything down to modesty today? What's some other things that ought to be addressed in our conversation of theology and fashion?
Yeah, I think that when we just simply reduce fashion to modesty, we miss so much. We miss understanding how we communicate and all the depth of communication. We miss understanding erotic comprehension, that a lot of the ways we work through the world is in terms of kind of comporting ourselves, right? So we miss understanding what worship is about, because so much of dress is all about our tactile embodied nature. So there's a whole world on that subject. We misunderstanding what modern art is doing, because you can't really understand fashion as an art form without at the same time being able to understand how modern art works as an art form and the challenges that has to Christianity and also the opportunities. We misunderstanding how identity is formed. We misunderstanding how the possibility of social identity and the way in which personal identity and narrative identity is erased. We don't understand the transgender revolution because we don't understand the way in which fashion assigns identity to identity markers, and those are interchanged regularly and pushed against all forms of all kind of like standardization of gender. I mean, there's so many things we don't understand, Parker, because we don't understand the world of fashion. I mean, I'm teaching a graduate class on fashion theology this summer in order to help begin this process of Christians understanding this facet of the world. But it's such a window into the modern world that we're all swimming in. But we just simply, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that if you don't understand what fashion is beyond modesty, then there's an awful lot of the world you're in that does not make sense to you. And I don't mean that you agree with it. I just mean you just have no way of even comprehending how to think about it.
Yeah. And yet you are swimming in that world. So yeah. Wow.
Yeah, it brings in issues of consumerism as well, right? And the role of the material world. It brings in issues of how social order is constructed, what social power is, and and you can't go to a museum these days without having the fashion wing, where you're going to go look at clothing as a piece of art. So
well, and that brings up another point that I wanted to talk about, which I guess is contentious. Maybe it's not as contentious as I picked, or I think it is. But is fashion actually art? And I like how you problematized it for us in the book, and I brought it up to my wife. Just sometimes I like to ask her random questions, and I just go like, is fashion art? And she's like, yeah, I think so. And I'm like, yeah, but it's like it's a utility. You're using it every day. You don't use a painting every day? And so it was really fun to think through that with her. But I
Mhm.
don't know where I land on that because I haven't studied this. But what do you think? What's the debate there? And then how do you answer it? Is fashion art?
Yeah. Oh, wow. You're going to make me let the cat out of the bag. Yeah, I talk about kind of classical theological aesthetics and how that would answer that question, and then how more neo-reformed sources, Calvin Searfield and Nicholas Wolterstorff and others,
Yeah.
might answer that question. I do think that not all fashion is art.
Okay.
Sometimes, I mean, we're both wearing collared shirts, I think.
No, I'm just wearing a plain. Yeah.
Plain blue. Okay, you got a non-collar, you got a collar shirt, but both of these are part of the fashions, like kind of system. But I don't think either of these are pieces of art. I think that they could become pieces of art, but the kind of enchantment process by which something becomes a piece of art probably doesn't have one or two qualifications. It probably has like a number of possible things, and there's a critical mass of those qualifications to which then we would recognize it as art.
Yeah.
Maybe A through G, and if you have like B, D, and F, then that's enough. And
Yeah.
if
Yeah.
Andy Warhol comes up and I don't know what, like signs your shirt, and well,
Right.
let's throw that in the museum.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. And you bring it. I mean, you put a picture in here of the Campbell soup pi- uh, art painting. I think it was first, and then it was on a dress as well.
mhm,
And
mhm.
that is art. And I like the qualification you said. Yeah, if you have like 4 or 5 out of 10 or something like that, and I think we kind of do this intuitively, and maybe we don't always have the words for it. But you say, yeah, no, that's art, and that's not. And someone says, well, why? And you're like, I don't know, just is.
Mhm.
You recognize it, I recognize it, but yeah, it is helpful. It's fun to think that there are people thinking through these kind of things. What what would I ever so like if I love wearing um I love wearing superhero shirts with like old comic books on there. Like the actual cover from the old comic book. I think it's great. I love it. I don't know why, but I work with college kids and they like it too. So is that is that art? It's someone's art that's on my shirt, but I could see some people saying, well, that's kind of a commodification of that art. And it's like, yeah, but it's a comic book. They're commodifying it in the first place.
Mhm.
Um, how might we go about thinking that? And if you answer it is art, then that would actually help me with my wife too. But
uh, well, Walter Benjamin talks about the mechanical reproduction of
yeah,
items
yeah,
as a disqualifier for it to be art,
yeah,
that because it removes the enchantment. And I am taken by his argument,
yeah,
and I think that by virtue of just now that doesn't mean that there haven't been found objects that have been then included in art installations, but oftentimes it's actually a self-reflexive installation, and the art installation is meant to be a site of meaning, which is challenging canons of art, and so therefore it
mm,
actually is not that it's a mechanically reproduced object that we are therefore validating as an art object, but it's actually that it's raising a really interesting question and therefore becoming a valuable site of meaning,
yeah.
aesthetic meaning, and that
The
therefore
intention,
qualifies it for being in
yeah,
the,
yeah.
yeah,
So the intention like outdoes the mechanical nature by which it was made.
yes.
Yeah, that's great. I like that. Well, I think you brought that up in the book about mechanism, mechanical reproduction. I thought that was good, but I thought it was great, and I thought it was convincing as well. But I thought of so in the background here we have I forgot the painter's name, but it's Augustine in his study, and it's one of my favorite pictures. I ought to know the name of the artist, but behind me here I have it up on my wall, and it's just a print that I got off of like Etsy or something, and I thought it is obviously art. It's a beautiful. I think it's one of the most beautiful paintings I've ever seen. I love that style. I love that whole period. But yet, I had someone print it up for me by this mechanistic process. Does that diminish the art itself, or is it because it's based on an original hand drawn, hand painted painting? Does the mechanism does that take it out of it?
Yeah, it does. It, it
Okay.
it would be far superior to have the original piece in
Yes.
your study. And if
Yeah.
you did, you would march people in to look at it.
Yes. That's true. That's true. Okay. Okay. Yeah, that's good. So yeah, putting it on a shirt would be even worse probably, because then you made it like a utility, and you're using it every day. You're using it for clothing. Well, that's not
I'm not saying
necessarily
it's
true.
not art. I'm not
Yeah.
saying it's not art.
Yeah.
I'm just saying that 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 there is the art that and I don't want to get into a Kantian view that art is something that requires, absorbed attention with no utility. I do not like seeing utility as the way in which we qualify what art is. And
Okay.
yeah, so I think Nicholas Wolterstorff has done. I've been very taken by Nick's work, and I think his recent work on art, art rethought, really. He basically is going to say that it's about sites of meaning,
Hmm.
and there's certain kinds of critical masses of sites of meaning within certain images and objects that then we kind of instinctually know that that deserves our attention. Though I don't want to say it deserves our like contemplation. I'm not sure if I want to say contemplation, but I want to say
Okay.
attention, right?
Okay. Yeah. That's really helpful. Sites of meaning. So does is it I don't want to say it's relative, but it's kind of relative to us, right? Like the sites of meaning, because we give things meaning, and that's okay. God made us in His image. He gives things meaning. We're reinterpreters. We reinterpret things, give things meaning. But what do we do with like the is there an objective nature to art and fashion? I know we're getting down far afield here, so sorry about that. I'm dragging you in.
Oh, no, it's great. Yeah, it's great. I love this kind of subject. Yeah. So, is there objective meaning? I guess what I want to say is that just because you might want to say that the definition of art uh, is that I mean, is that it's a site of meaning. That doesn't mean that we've then ruled out like transcendent beauty as
Mhm.
one possible reason we might value an art piece,
Yeah.
or that it can't be used for contemplation,
Okay.
or it can't be an object that in many ways kind of has a certain kind of critical mass of enchantment.
Hmm.
But I think that that there's lots of reasons why we might consider something a piece of art, and there's many different. Most art objects were at one time simply created for a function. I think
Yeah.
that I read that there was a conversation about putting all the religious paintings in the museums in Europe back in the churches where they were actually originally placed. And then the next comment was, but we would have nothing to show in our museums. Because originally they were meant to be objects that were utilized for worship, right?
Right. Right.
And not just simply to go and stare at it in some secular space,
Yeah.
with people from all different cultures,
Yeah.
and in a Kantian way. So
Right. Well, that's a great point. Yeah, I guess I've kind of caught that Kantian view accidentally about utility, and I need to work on that. I have I don't know if you ever heard of this before. There's a leather company called Saddleback Leather. Are you familiar with that at all?
no.
Yeah, so he's great. He's a great guy. He turned out to be a Christian, which is cool too. And he has really great leather products, and uh, it makes me think all the time, because they're meant to be beat up. They're meant to be like weathered, and they're really tough. And there's a 100-year warranty and stuff like that. But it's like fitting this line between utility and art, I'd say, and it's really beautiful. But I need to rethink that. I need to. This is Your book was the first introduction that I had to this, and so it's kind of messing with me a little bit. It's really good, but it's making me think. Where might someone go? So they read your book. They love this podcast. What's next to study on fashion, and is there anything else on fashion theology even out there?
Yeah, it's an exciting, emerging new field.
Mm.
I feel very honored to have kind of launched it. Um, I am working with two doctoral students right now who are
Mm.
doing their dissertations on fashion theology, and I do know of a Jesuit who teaches at the University of Paris, who has just finished a book, I believe, but it's in Italian,
Okay.
and it's a kind of a Roman Catholic approach. So so oh gosh, what is his name? It's on the tip of my tongue. Alberto Amoroso, I think.
Okay.
Alberto Amoroso. I had a nice Zoom chat with him. I was expecting a monk with with some kind of habit, and the guy was super cool with like a cool kind of soccer haircut and an Adidas t-shirt. So
Nice.
Jesuits these days. But
Yeah.
so he's kind of leading the charge in ways, and he has a nice article out. But this is happening right now, and the field is massive. And so if
Yeah.
you know of any students that are interested in doing their dissertation work on the subject, they should definitely reach out to me, because there's so many possible dissertations within this field.
Yeah. No, that's huge. I can especially think of the ethics of it. And intentionality is another big one. That's big in philosophy of mind, but I could definitely see this in dress and for Christians thinking through. So, if I wear a shirt because it's really tight on my arms and I want my arms to look big, is that okay? And thinking through, this is the kind of stuff that I work with college athletes. I work with wrestlers, and these are the kind of things we think through. We're thinking about sanctification. We're thinking, yeah, dude, I want my abs to show, not me, them, because they're super jacked still, but I want to kind of draw attention to this. I worked really hard for it. Well, why not?
Mm-hmm.
And it always comes to modesty, and for me, because that's where I've been. Yeah, so I've been really encouraged by this, because it's not just an interesting thing. It's very interesting, and I usually I can go for that. You can pique my interest, and I'll read a book, but it's actually really cool because of the whole modesty conversation, that I need to be thinking that there's more to it than just this modesty. There's more to how we communicate ourselves to others. And what I thought was so cool as I was reading this, and I think it came up in your treatment of Calvin. I'm thinking that the proto in Genesis 3, God made he gave animal skins and animal furs to Adam and Eve, and he dressed them, and they tried to dress themselves with fig leaves, and it wasn't enough. There's some symbolism there about, you're trying to cover your sin with your own works, but God can cover the sin, and it's going to cost, a life, and you need blood sacrifice. But God made them clothes. I mean, God was the first, like true good fashion designer here. I thought that was awesome.
Yeah. The story of Genesis there. One of the things we miss is that, and this is a great kind of way to bring it to a close, is before the fall, Adam and Eve were seeing and being seen by each other. And that we know that's true because of the beautiful poetry that's found when man first, set sight on woman. Bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. And when we look at the biblical record, what's fascinating is that when that seeing and being seen gets corrupted through sin, God then redeems it. And the clothing he gives is not the shoddy stuff, the fig leaves, the makeshift, the kind of fast fashion, we might say. The stuff that's not going to last. God produces some quality that is going to provide for them. And so there's something really beautiful about God's own embrace. I don't know if I want to say God's a fashion designer. I don't think Calvin would like that. Calvin definitely would not like that language. But I will say that there is something that should touch us about the biblical theology of clothing from Genesis to Revelation, which is actually my next book that I'm about halfway through. So I'm looking forward to that.
Awesome. Well, Robert, thanks so much for your time. Thanks for the book, man. This is really helpful for me. It's broadened my perspective, my horizon. It was really, really good. I really enjoyed this book. If someone is thinking about working on this, writing a paper on it, or doing their dissertation or whatever, go ahead and leave that in the comments here, and I can get to Robert's email here, and we can get you guys in touch. Robert, any other places to find you that you want to plug? Anything like that?
Yeah, generally speaking, if you Google my name, you can find my academia.edu website, and I serve as a pastor at Christ Church Sierra Madre, and you can also reach out to me there. But please do, if you'd like to continue the conversation, I'm happy to do that.
Awesome. All right. Well, We could talk about this more, and Lord willing, someday we will. But for now, it's going to have to do it. This has been Parker's Pensées, and as always, all glory to God.